Hey guys, it's Fifflaren, also known as 944. Don't forget Thorin's YouTube channel.
I'm here for another episode of Reflections, and my guest for this one is going to be Fifflaren, and obviously he is a return guest, although it was, this is how old esports is now. It was actually a decade ago that we did the other one, believe it or not, when he obviously was at the end of his time in NiP. Now, the joke I even did say before we went live is like, you might wonder, how can there be a part two? Because I mean, his CSGO career ended in the end of the last one, and spoiler, he hasn't played in the last decade, so there obviously isn't like a new frontier. But to be fair, what people might not actually know is, obviously, Fifflaren's been behind the scenes in the industry, he's done a bunch of stuff with Twitch, so there are some side stuff, and also, since it is the name of the show, I've just found over time, it's different to interview someone about something from like a year before, as opposed to 10 years before. I feel like your perspective, like the show reflected, when you reflect back, it's very different, you know, different emotions attached, some things fall away. I mean, I'll give you an obvious example to start the interview with. I find actually one thing that's quite cool when I do interviews with people who are retired is, dude, it feels like all the whatever bitterness they had, or like, you know, when you like you have rival, it feels like that just melts away, and then people just have like a really cool like perspective on their career and all the good things and the battles there. Do you find it similar when you just think back on their playing days and you think back 10 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. And fun to be back, Duncan. Like you said, it's been 10 years. I can't believe it. Definitely the age, if you even look at me, I'm like, God damn, I'm old. No, I do. Like you said, I think the bitterness definitely has faded. I think a lot of the stuff that felt petty or that was a big thing back then is like just petty now. Or you get to a point where you also get older where it's like stuff like that just feels less meaningful or less impactful. So, and I think the first time we did it, or the first reflection we did, it was like maybe a few weeks after I had stopped playing, yes, or like a few months. And I think back then I still was very, you know, upset about the whole situation, about what happened and, you know, how it came to be. And, you know, you always had those thoughts of like, well, what could have I done differently? Like, would it have changed things and whatnot? Versus now it's like, you know, looking back, it's like, I got a ton of really cool opportunities and experiences that not a lot of people did, which led me to get a job, obviously, in this space and continue on like my personal development. And for that, I'm really grateful. And I don't think I would be in the position I am today if I didn't have the experience, right? And a lot of the stuff that I do nowadays is with the experience that I had, especially with NiP, you know, with what came to be, all the stuff that happened. And I use that now to my advantage, right? Of having been there, having gone through all of it. What can we do better? So yeah, it's been a wild ride, but it's definitely been like very fulfilling.
Right, one thing I wanted to do was we will actually go back in time a little bit. So here's the first question I have actually. Now that you have been retired from actual competition for a long time, here's the question I have. When you think of the Source heyday, does it get like one of those big fish stories where, you know, over the years it gets better and better? Do you feel like the further away you are, do you think that you were sicker and sicker and sicker? Like if you think back now to a young Fifflaren, does he seem like he was fucking sick at the game compared to like the old man version?
I mean, so if you go back and you asked me that even 10 years ago, I would probably have like an answer of like, yeah, there's some cockiness. I feel like I did deserve to be in the teams that we're in. But I think if you compare it to nowadays, how the scene has developed and where it's been, I think absolutely, right, looking back, I can totally see the criticism that I got for the last like year of me competing of, you know, maybe I shouldn't have been there. Maybe there's better players to, you know, take my reign. And I think even back in Source, a lot of the things, and I still think that there's a problem still to this day where it's really hard to showcase what someone does on a team if you just don't think about stats. And that honestly, if anything, that was my takeaway, because, you know, I got so much flack for years when I was playing on NiP, and my biggest thing was that you started believing what people were saying, right? Of like, yeah, maybe they would be better with someone else. And now looking back, right, and you see, and I still take credit for this a little bit. You look at the amount of events that they won after the fact that they removed me from the lineup, and I think it's 2. And then I think with that, it kind of like justified my role in the team. I think for myself a little bit more. I think a lot of the fans also came out with that of like, oh, actually, like maybe it wasn't so bad when he was there. Okay. And that is my takeaway from all of it, where it's like still to this day, I don't feel like management know everything. You know, I think that they revolve a lot about just what people say on the internet versus actually getting to a point where it's like, well, what does this person actually provide for these teams? I'm still going to keep my Source ego a little bit. Okay. Same thing there. I do feel like at the time, if even looking back of like, oh, what could they have done differently with the NiP roster? And I think preemptively, I still think people struggle with this to this day, where it's like we actually did a really good job with building the team. Like, I think had I been a person with a massive ego, like maybe what like others had, I don't think this team would have been as successful. Like, you need someone that takes the hit sometimes, right? You need someone that gets the shitty end of the stick sometimes, and you need someone that is just there to win and not just for yourself. So I think a lot of takeaways, and like I said, I use it a lot in my day-to-day work nowadays as well, like speaking about things. I think at the end of the day, you win as a team or you lose as a team. Even Sai Wu, right? Like there's a lot of memes, right? Oh, he's the only one, like, pulling his weight. But I think that's the beauty of games in general. Like, there's so many different things you can do to be successful, and they showcase that, right? And I think we were one of the first few teams that actually did get that spotlight, where you had 4-star players essentially, and the one support that didn't get a lot of space. But whatever, at the end of the day, like, whatever helps the team win, I think is the most important thing. So.
Okay, that's a pretty good opening statement there, guys. He tried to actually sort of encapsulate his whole career in one answer there. So obviously, here's the thing. Since this isn't going to be like a chronological interview, we can bounce around on topics. So I'll try to bundle them all together. So obviously, one thing you're referencing there, this was something I planned on asking you. Because what's funny is, the only person who ever brings this up is actually Richard. And even Richard isn't enemies with lurppis anymore, right? But I know, because of the emotion he had back then in 2014, obviously, he actually does low-key. I think that's the one thing he holds against himself. Because people don't know, the problem lurppis has, if you're not fully aware of him, maybe you've only seen him on shows, or like, is he actually is kind of like you see on camera. He's a really, really blunt person. I'm not even saying just in the normal Finnish sense. Like, I've told him this, mate. I'm open. I hope people know I'm autistic. I've always told him, mate, like, spoiler, in your case, don't get a test, because I know what the answer's going to be, mate. Like, because he does that thing where I've even told him, mate, like, one of his problems on Twitter, he still does it to this day, is he actually does that thing where he thinks that, like, you shouldn't talk shit behind people's backs. So when he flames someone, he'll just tag them on Twitter. And I always tell him, like, bruh, like, they're going to see that, though. And even though he's thinking, like, yeah, but that's like being honest, I actually tell him, like, no, but actually sometimes it is appropriate to talk shit behind people's backs, because it hurts their feelings when you say it to their face, mate. So in his particular case, right, he does think of himself as, he thinks of it as he was just an outsider, and it's sports, and what he's doing is, if I talk about Manchester United in football, right, obviously if I say I think they should fire the bloody manager, and plus what's that fucking defender doing, I don't really think he's going to read that and then go, what the hell, like, I have a job and career. Like, in that moment, I'm an external person, I'm just looking at a movie or a game, right? I think he thought he was just doing that. And so what's weird is, this is the complicated part about this question. If people are fans and they don't know, obviously Fifflaren has worked with lurppis since then. They've actually been colleagues. In fact, bizarrely, they actually get along in real life. They're actually quite friendly people. I've never seen any issues. But here's the question I have. One, when he was, because at the time, by the way, I wasn't doing events at the time. Obviously, I hadn't started doing the big events. I'd only done 1 or 2. And by the way, I didn't have this persona. He was actually sort of in my role. He was the guy, essentially. Like, in this analogy, you were falling and he was calling you out. Like when I did that tweet, everyone lost their minds over that few years back. He was kind of in that position, and he was the person that was drawing all the fire in the community. And in this case, the perception people thought was that he's being mean to you, or he's targeting you, he's unfair. And I know in Richard's case, I think what pisses him off is this. Obviously, the team was winning a lot of events, and his whole sort of shit was sort of like, yeah, but then they'd win the event and be even better if they had this guy, right? Yeah. When you look back now, there's a lot there, but how do you handle that? Because one, he was like kind of the face of the criticism, right? 2, somehow you've gotten past it since, but then 3, at the time, did part of you sort of think like, fuck, was part of you a bit pissed? Did you have an animosity towards him at the time? What would you say about that whole topic?
Yeah, for sure. I think going back and like talking about lurppis especially, and like you mentioned, like we're friends now, and I think after the fact was done and stuff, like same kind of thinking on my end of like, it's petty, whatever, right? Like I think my problem that I had with how he conducted himself was that I was in everything. Like he did an article about very games. I was in the very games.
Oh, right.
Like,
you just go by you with everything, right?
Yeah, literally. And I was used the example for everything, right? When something was bad, let's throw in there and the analogy. And I think the difference there as well of when you do it that way, as you mentioned, of like if you're a regular sports athlete, you don't spend this amount of time on the PC to begin with. No. You don't spend this amount of time on social. And like at that time, like HLTV was the place to go for games, for articles. You had the forum as well. And I went to a point where I couldn't go anywhere. Like I couldn't even go to read articles. I was just on there. And then, the forum post was there. To your point, he would tag people on Twitter. And I can see what he means by that. Like, I don't want to like talk shit behind people's backs, but it's like, well, the way that it works is you then tag me and then everyone jumps on the bandwagon.
Yeah.
So I did have a lot of mental issues. Like I remember back in the day, like it's one of the main things that I still talk to about like running teams now, where it's like, I never felt that I got any support, right, from the org in that regard. Like it was always like, oh shit, but he's terrible. Let's just try and get rid of him versus, you know, looking at things. I think that I would have been a much better player at the end had I just been getting that support. I got it from my team, you know, from my players, which is why I think I still use that mentality of, it doesn't matter what everyone else thinks, and what matters is what your team thinks, right? Like there's a reason why you're there. But I think back then I remember there's a scenario. I don't know the game. I just remember the round itself, and you can tell I'm not in a good mental state where T, the bomb is planted on dust 2 on A. He's diffusing, and I'm on like towards A pit. And there's a smoke in the background, I think, and I'm just tapping this guy. I'm not even hitting him, and he just ends up flat straight diffusing. And like during that whole time, my mental when I'm shooting these shots are, oh, I know from like there's going to be so many posts about this. There's going to be an article about this. It's going to be this. And I tried to confront Tommy about this one time at an event, and that's what pissed me off a little bit because he wouldn't tell me to my face, right, the things that he was saying. He would basically say like, I don't think you're very good. But he wouldn't like when you're trying to have a conversation with him, he wouldn't really justify it very well. And then 10 minutes later, there's now another post on Twitter, and she's like, "Dude, we just saw each other. Like, what's going on? Why aren't you saying that to my face?" Right? And I think, and here's where I can kind of move past it. Like, you know, Tommy and I talked after that, and we have to like you mentioned, like we worked together since then as well. And he said something, and I can give him a lot of praise for this as well, because it's not easy to say, but I think when you're a person in Tommy's shoes at that point, you have just come off from being a pro in 1.6, you didn't go through in CSGO, and you kind of feel like the game is bad, and I can't believe the players that's like competing at a pro level. And maybe he will never admit this, but I think there was a conversation with us back then where it's like, when you then are on the outside and you're missing out on this opportunity, it's very easy to then go and flame and be like, oh, it should have been me or whatever. But reality is, if he would have been good enough, maybe he would have still been competing, right? And there's a world there where you say, well, I'm still competing, you're not. Like, you can argue that you might still feel that you're better, but here I am winning all these events.
Right.
So I'd also argue that it's, I wouldn't say jealousy per se, but I do think it had something to do with that in the way that certain people.
Oh no, but Fifflaren, I'll totally admit, I get that. Like put it this way, what's funny is, even if I'm actually friends with and rate the analyst that gets hired instead of me, if I think I should work a major and someone else gets hired instead, you think I'm not sort of like, part of me's almost low-key like wanting to flame that guy, even if it's actually a mate, man. Like it's a human emotion, isn't it? You know? Yeah,
no, absolutely. And here's where I think my mental ended up. As soon as I retired, like here's the, like, you know, you ever go to a restaurant and you order a meal, and the meal you get in, it's great, right? Like you have no, it's just like, oh, it's what I paid for. It's good, right? You wouldn't go on the internet and talk shit about the restaurant. But if the meal is bad, you would obviously feel entitled to be like, oh, this is shit. Let me go and like go on Yelp or like a review site and just give them a bad review. And I feel like that actually, I make the joke, but that's kind of what I felt happened to me. As soon as I retired, like during the time that I was playing, I think my fans or the people that actually had the belief of that I should be there was very quiet. They didn't say anything. It was just kind of normal. And everyone that had then the bad experience, everyone was just flaming.
All right.
And as soon as I retired, like there was a flip that was switched. All of a sudden, I wasn't the most hated player anymore for some reason, right? I always did interviews. I always tried to be positive. Like I still had that. But as soon as I retired, I kind of felt like it was just a 180 of like, now the fans came out and it was all positivity instead. I got very little negativity once I stopped competing. It was all a lot of just positivity then, like, oh, please come back, like miss you on the server, like blah, blah, blah. And I think that for my mental, at least, that helped me a lot, right? Like, you know me, like we've known each other for so long. Like I'm not a negative person in general. Like I tend to be funny and positive and have a good time. And I think that at least like helped on that side, but like the experience that I had, right? Like definitely like Tommy and everyone else who jumped on it didn't help. I know they were doing their jobs, but I think if you compare to nowadays, it's like if you mentioned Fallen, right? Or if it's like at the moment, like Apex, right? Or like, oh, he's so bad at every article, even revolving like ends, it's like Apex is in there. It's like it gets to a point where it's like it's very mentally draining. Sure. Teams nowadays have performance coaches, right? Like mental coaches. There's much more support in that regard. I think they can handle it much better versus the way that we were, right? It's like first time using Twitter. We needed it for the org. The org is pushing us to be more marketing and social front, which means that we have to be on this. We want you to reply to fans and be like, yeah, I'm not getting away from it.
Yeah, actually, that's a good segue because I actually hadn't thought of that. But to be fair, if people don't know, like pretty soon, I only joined Twitter in I think like 2009, and the joke is it literally was I only did it because Slasher just annoyed me until I did it. Because he was like, everyone's got to get on this new thing because you know how he is. Like even back then he was the same, and at the time it was like everyone's got but in the early years, you know, there was like, you had like, what, 300 followers, you know, it was other people you knew in the industry. It wasn't like this big social phenomenon. In fact, I often tell people, the joke is back then, it was more like what old school Facebook was like. It's just your friends and family you message. You're not messaging random Billy nobody in some other country. But then it eventually became this, man, it almost became like forums and like IRC. Like anyone could come on, anyone could comment. There are random people. I hadn't thought that actually, because obviously in Source and 1.6, it wasn't really a thing, social media. Like the joke is, even if Twitter existed, like Forrester wasn't on there, or if he was, you know, all he posted was one clip a year and then never fucking logged on. But I hadn't thought that. You also were the first one to get the social media scrutiny because, as we say, you were, even though the joke is you were in the winning team, you were the most scrutinized player. And I guess it must have been you, right? It was like that in Source, I'm guessing. No,
I mean, absolutely not. And like you said, usually you would just have forums, right? Or back then you would have IRC, but same thing. It would be just a community. It would be very close knit. And now you gave like this vertical basically where everyone, and it's fake accounts. It could be bots. It could be the same person for all you know that's commenting. Like you get them the outlet of basically like, oh, I can get to this person. And back when we started playing, this was right at the boom of Justin TV and Known.tv as well. It's during the live streaming phase. Like I don't use social media anymore. Like I don't tweet anymore. Like my followings is from 10 years ago. And like you said, like that, there was a boom that happened like in the middle of it where no one really gave a damn. Like it was for friends and family. It's why you see all these like past tweets that from people that are pretty bad, right? Into now just exploding. Like I ended up, I think when I retired, I was at like 140,000 Twitter followers back then, which is insane, right? To think about. Compared to now, it's like, well, that's just like any other player. But like back then, it wasn't really.
That was big.
Normal. Yeah, and then with that, that was people following. Just imagine the width and the range then, and people then would do an article or something, would go somewhere else. Yeah, it was everywhere. You couldn't get away from it.
And then the other thing is, like, I actually want you to expand on that a bit. The thing I'll admit I hadn't even thought of myself is, but it makes perfect sense as soon as you say it is, even though people always, when they hear criticism, you notice the natural response is always like, oh, it's bullshit. I don't care about that. People say that famous line, I don't care what people think. Even when I say that, what you really mean is, I wish I didn't. We all do care what people think. We all want to be liked, obviously. No. In fact, the joke is, if you're really cool, you didn't care what people think, you wouldn't say that. You'd just be like, Clint Eastwood, you wouldn't care, would you? But the point I'm getting to is, I didn't think about the fact that it's not like we say that, but then when you go in the game, your mind gets wiped and you play identically. Obviously, that does get to you. Like, you will think, like you said, you'll second guess yourself. In fact, I have no doubt it totally changes the way you then frame when the game starts to go badly, or you're doing badly, or like the classic example would be if you're in like a really bad CT spot. The classic ones like B, Mirage, fucking Anchor, obviously. I bet it's even worse thinking if there's three people coming in, the guys rotate. I bet it totally changes how you even approach a duel or what you're going to do in the game, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You get to a point where, same thing, I use that a lot with current teams that I'm working with, is that you get to a point where you're too scared to make mistakes because you don't want to get shunned, right? You don't want to get flamed, but it's that you forget to realize it's like, well, it's those things that you do on the server that makes you unique as well. So if you get to a point where you don't allow yourselves to be making these mistakes, how are you going to make these, like the cold stare around the Mirage, right? Like the jumping, like it's so unheard of. But it's like, unless you try it and you have the mentality enough to know, like, yeah, maybe, you know, it's going to be bad or it's going to be fucking incredible. You know, I'm going to get a highlight here, you know, play of the year, or it's going to be, people are going to call me an idiot, right, for like making a play. And I think, especially in Counter-Strike, we had that a lot. I think when you look at our majors as well, like the choke aspect of things, the two majors we lost and came second. Like if you go back, you watch those games and you say, well, we didn't play like ourselves. And it comes with the scrutiny of like, well, we're expecting to win. If we don't, we're going to get, you know, laughed at or whatever. We don't want to make mistakes. You now start to play very defensive. You're not playing your own game, and you basically just turtle up. And then for me, it was every game, Duncan. You know, like when I walked into my last year, and that's where I'm also okay with like having been removed, looking back at it, where I just wasn't in a good mental state either. Right. But I also then account for that of like, if you have an org and you know for a fact that the team really wants to play with this 5 and you know there's a team that's won so much, and rather than just saying whatever, like why not look for like some sort of support of like let's try and solve it before it's like yeah, it's completely gone. But instead of doing that, then nothing happened. Like I went the whole year. My team was super supportive, and I still use this example to this day. But yeah, I would go into every game. That VP final game, for example, dude, my mental there heading into, I didn't know that I had only 9 kills, but I know that I was getting absolutely destroyed. I couldn't even peek anyone. I got insta-killed. My mentality was like, oh my God, like, you know, not only are we about to lose this major, we're not playing well, but I know that I'm going to be the massive scapegoat. Like I know for a fact that everything will be about me after the loss. Not that we didn't play good as a team. Sure. I obviously didn't play well, but at the end of the day, win as a team, lose as a team. Like I would never, and same thing with wins, I would never account for the win on just one player. Like I will also never account for a loss on the one player. But I think that's a lot what you get, right? It's like, oh, it's Saiwu, it's winning everything. It's not the team, right? Or like, oh, this person is losing them everything and it's not the team. And it's like, well, maybe that's not the case. And I think I justify that, right? Like there was always the memes about like NiP playing 4 versus 5. Like at the end of the day, I never believed that. Like there's not a chance, even if people did say like the competition was a little bit weaker and stuff like that. Of like, no, I mean, everyone had what, you know, their duties on the server essentially. Of I never saw ourselves at 4v5. I feel like I was very impactful at times, and you know, my role on the server, I think that I actually did very well. I'm just sad that there wasn't any stats or anything to support it. Like nowadays, you at least have flash assists or anything like that. Nothing like that.
Another thing as well is it's actually quite cool that, as you say, actually the team at the time was supportive. I didn't know at the time that was the case because, look, I know since then they've all been very nice, and even actually we'll get to this later, but some of them even think actually now that they line up should have stayed together, they should have had like another chance or kept it running. Or I mean, the joke with some of the Dingta scenes, even though you weren't playing there, was like, so we should get the team back together. It was great. But what I would ask is this: the reason why I actually think that's quite unusual and notable is, first of all, even some of those players, I can tell you in 1.6, mate, they weren't like that when sometimes a teammate was bad. Like I'll tell you what, back then, I'd even say it's a bit like those Brazilian teams when they start to drop off. I feel like actually when you notice that the team's not as good and you don't win as much, but you know one person gets scrutinized, if it's not you just don't say anything because it's like, listen, all the fucking shit's going that way. Look, it's not like I'm joining in, you know, it's not my fault, but at the same time, I don't want fucking turning on me and making it about me. So I think oftentimes actually people just kind of like let that person be on their own, and then they look, maybe they even hope it goes better, but they don't want to get involved in that shit and share that problem. It's kind of cool that actually they were like supportive, because I would say that one of the reasons why Fifflaren was always going to get hated on by fans, spoiler, this happened to all the others eventually, is if someone's a mega super fan of Get Right or Forest, their perception isn't you had an all right game or it's that you cost Get Right or Forest a championship. They're supposed to win every tournament. They're the best. I've noticed, by the way, it's never their fault. They can have 10 frags. That's okay. Sure. If you have 8, you were shit. I don't really get why, because proportionally they had a worse game and that's not. But this sounds quite significant that they kind of vouch for you. Actually, they understood the situation you were in, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll say this as well, because I used my experience with what happened there. So I think it was about, I don't know, maybe a year into playing or whatever. My first 6 months in NiP, I actually had a full-time job. I was one of the only ones that did that. So I was working 9 to 5. I came back, 10 minutes break, and then into gaming for the first 6 months. And then the last there, after about a year, it's when I started getting, I always got hounded, right? Like from day one, my first interview with HLTV was, we need to bring the communities together, and everyone just straight flamed me. It's like, screw this guy, you know, bring his source player.
Positive message as well.
Yeah. It was like insane. And then and then into like just a constant, like you mentioned, like the Tommies and all the articles and stuff like that. I think about a year in, or like a year and a half in, like they start noticing, like I am very hard on myself. Like when I feel like I've had a bad game, like I'm not just gonna be like, you know, it was Get Right, not Trumpet 30 is why we won. No, it's like, no, I'm properly pissed at myself. And at that time that it had gone so far that I couldn't drop it. Like it was a lot of times that at that time, like I would have a bad game rather than being over it in an hour or two. Like it would take me a day. And then finally the team sat me down and they said, listen, Robin, like, you know, at the end of the day, like what matters the most is what we think. It's not what the community thinks. Like you're our teammate. And if we feel like you should be here, like you need to trust us rather than what the community says. And that was I always knew that, but I felt like them saying it, and this is the whole team. It wasn't just a one individual, like they were all sitting down with me. And I felt like that assurance of like, man, I actually have people that backs me up. And that same speech is actually something that I've had with not only Smits when he was going through versus what I was going through. I also had it with Taco when he was going through it in his team. And I had exactly the same speech. And obviously, wouldn't you know it, for both of these two players, they would go back and they would say, yeah, I mean, that's what my team says as well. Like, I should listen to them. And in both cases, I actually think both of them have used that example as well in the future to kind of like speak about things. And that's like so also like warming to hear, to see like a small statement like that actually holds so much weight. And but in reality, you might say, oh, it's just, you know, it's just a guy saying, oh, you're like, you deserve to be here. But when you then add everything together, like even my management want to get rid of me, right? Like from almost like day one, it was only the first CEO that wanted to keep me, which was Nicholas, obviously the guy that ended up getting, you know, all the drama around him. And then you can kind of see what happens after that, right? I'm gone after 8 months. And I think the only thing that I can go back to, and I don't fault the players for this at all, like even in our contracts, management couldn't kick us. It was about the team, but we were in such bad financial shape. And again, you can go back and listen to my story, right, with NiP and all that. Like we were not doing very well, right? Like we were basically paying for free.
By the way, I'll link the interview with Richard where you talked about all this. Obviously, everyone could catch up on that. Yeah. We were basically playing for like pennies, right? And like at that time, like people have girlfriends, they have lives. Like there's a point where you're just scared of. Like you said, Duncan, like if it's not me, I'm gonna be quiet because I still get a paycheck. And I do feel like that was kind of what happened there. And like you said, looking back, and I met these guys, and I'm still friends with all the former NiP guys. But then looking back, and I think it's one of the things that they go back and they say as well of like, man, I feel like we should have said something in that moment. Like the way that they told me was that they just brought me in a room, right? First, they told me by myself and Peter, and then they walked into a room with all the players, right? They're like, hey, yeah, he's gone now, you know, and everyone's just sitting there, right. You know. Yeah. People were sad, obviously. I think if this was a different time, like, having them to say like, this is not okay, I think would have been different. But again, you're in a position where you have to think about yourself. Like we're just cash poor. Like you just never know. It doesn't matter if you get right or force or like Saiwu simple or whatever, like that unknown back then of like, well, am I going to find myself another team? Or like, you know, before we had re-signed, we got a date to re-sign this contract with NiP. Before that, we're like, what if we go and we say we don't sign and then we just go public and we say, hey, the best team in the world, it's basically free agents. Let's sign. Nobody had the guts to do it because we weren't in financial shape. Hence why it was dragging on. Oh, we need them, kind of, right? Even though we know that they were taking advantage of us. Yeah. I'll tell you what, I'll segue. Here's the question I have that I was just thinking of while you were saying that is, I hadn't thought of this, but I'll give you a quick analogy, right? Believe it or not, I actually nowadays sometimes get more mad when I see people sort of do the things that they fuck with me over, but when they do it to people like Richard, somehow the fact it's not me makes me more mad. I almost feel more protective, like, oh, fuck, I know what it's like to have people, you know, go after you on that thing or that. And what I want to know, in your case, I thought of this as well. It must have also been tough the years later, because the joke is both Exist and Freiburg went through the same thing. It just took them a few years longer, and then eventually they were the one on the hot seat, and every fan was asking for them and saying the same thing. Get right, Forest shouldn't have to play with these guys, and then they got kicked, and it must have been crazy watching it, almost like it's like a horror movie. One by one, people get picked off, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. And same thing. I was always, if you go back and you look at like even between Source and CSGO, I was always thinking about myself in terms of like I can't rely on just gaming as a whole. Like it's not there yet. Like I need to make sure that I have something like lined up in the back. And I think for a lot of these guys, that's not the case. It's like, well, we're professional gamers, right? Like that's what we're doing. And I feel like up until that point, same thing. There's this like, you're scared of losing your position. Like what happens, what ifs, and you're seeing all this stuff happen. Like you said, like I was the first one, but like it continues, right? And the way that it's conducted and the way that it's done is like so tasteless. Whereas like these guys are the ones that built your whole brand, and you're literally like just taking them, you're throwing them to the curb. They're trying to do the same thing with Get Right, and be like, you're retiring now. This event, we're gonna announce you, by the way. And he's like at that, and you see it when OG Borg is asking, and he goes, "I'm not effing retiring." Like what, you know? And it's like that stuff that made me. It makes me sad. And I think when I then came out with that news thing with Richard, I felt a lot of, not blame, but I felt like I was in some way like part of people's bad experiences because we had made it to what it was. So
as in you guys could have like cut it off earlier if you'd have taken a stand, like you say, right? I see what you mean.
Because there were so many people that, you know, back then, like I had so many DMs of people getting burned, and it wasn't just players. And then all of a sudden I felt like I was in a position where you know, because none of the other, at that time, Patrick, I think, and Get was still in NiP. Freiburg, I think, was still owed money, and like nobody wanted to say something. I was only in a position there where I'm like, well, I'm over it, right? Nice. Like it's been 5 years, like the money that I'm just never going to see it again. So like, why not talk about my story? Since I saw at that time, like every few months there would come out something else, right? And the latest is like Knock, right, with the major sticker money, and it just continued. But yeah, I mean, going through and seeing all of that, and the last person, right, that was left on the team was Forrest. And then you'd argue of like, what was Getright's wishes from like the get-go? Is like, well, he's the face of the team, right? He wanted to do it, like he wanted to be more involved, and the way that he was treated, I honestly just felt bad. It was one of those things where I just feel like, man, like these guys, like outside of me, like this, they deserve better. Like they're legends of the space. They have made your brand to what it is today. Like trendsetters in the beginning of a title that is still to this day like one of the largest, biggest titles in the world. Of like, compared to NHL, right? Like put their jersey on the roof or whatever. Like there's so much stuff there versus what you know, what they ended up getting was like, you know, listen, we're gonna like hammer you down, like lower your pay or whatever. And at the end of it, like we're gonna try and make sure we don't pay you what you're owed. Like we're gonna try and skimp you, you know, there as well. And it's just like, dude, like that's insane. Like what are you doing with the players that's really like representing your brand? Like it's unheard of, right? Especially in gaming at that time. It was like you never had orcs of that stature and that like size that would actively go out of their way to really just see these players as pawns.
Yeah, actually, one thing you mentioned earlier is I guess that actually is where the timing was brutal. Because as you said, if people don't know, and you'll find out in the Richard interview, the problem was almost the entire time they were in NiP, as bad as it sounds, winning is actually what kept them trapped. They were made, it was kind of like a golden cage. Funnily enough, it's actually comparable in the older era of esports to what teams used to have at events. Like, you have to be paid from the past events. Because, by the way, events don't immediately pay when the event ends. It's not poker. It takes months and months. And back then, it sometimes took like a year to get the prize money, if you know. Because they also had cash flow issues. They were stealing from Peter to pay Paul, as we say. But then the other thing is, if you think about the timing of when you got kicked, which was like autumn of fucking 2014, well, no one could have known it at that time, Fifflaren, but it was literally like 4 months later in early 2015 when all those LCS orgs came in and like Envious was here from Call of Duty and like, and the joke is, what you're saying there, like if I could actually go back in a time machine, what I'd just tell you is this: forget what they owe you, mate. The joke is, if you just actually do leave and declare like that, like we're free agents sort of, because they've fucked us over, you actually could basically have almost like, they would have almost been like a bidding war for you. You would have had the whole lineup, and you would have all been on those pumped up salaries. Like the real joke is that you couldn't know it at the time, because at the time we thought that was as big as CS was getting, but you actually would just behind the wave almost. I actually feel like the move you're describing would have been the gangster move, would be like, hey, if they're not going to pay us, like we go public then. Who wants us? And then you get, I mean, there's a million orgs might have come at that point, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like you said, and that's where like we played the monthly comp we ended up getting, right, is like the back pay from prize money that we were winning like 8 months before. So like you said, even when we were talking about potentially leaving, it's like, well, we're like, there's so much prize money because we attended everything back then too. It wasn't just like one event a month. Like we were at 2-3 events a month. And because they were so delayed on payments, same thing, because of the sketchiness. Well, when you leave, what are the odds that they're just going to take it? And obviously they end up taking it anyway. But like at that time, you don't know that. And like you said, like I'll give you a good example here. Like I retired basically the year before everything blows up, right? Like in terms of salaries, like I was making with prize money, right? I remember they didn't even pay my tax or anything, like $2K a month. And that's with all the stuff that we won at the end of it, right? And like I was owed a lot. My last, and this was the first, I think, first or second stickers. So that I did get the money there because Valve had connected. It wasn't signatures. I missed that with one major. I didn't get signatures. I just sent it in. I didn't get to play the last major. But the money that I then got from stickers, and you can see that now the clear change in how the game has exploded. My cut was about $7,600. And then nowadays, you heard the Paris major last year, like people were making millions.
Yes, literally.
So I am. There's this sadness in me of like, oh, I missed the train. Like, I wish I would have like competed or like been a little bit younger. There's the flip side of me in saying, well, I'd still got all that experience, and same thing with that experience, I wouldn't have been to where I am today, and having, you know, gotten all these opportunities, the job at Twitch, like getting to GM for Dignitas. Like I account for that with my history with gaming. And who knows if I would have still done that, or let's say I would have stayed. You know, nowadays there's a lot of former esports pros, right? Like with maybe technically experienced. Back then, I was only I was very one of the few, especially like in that like level of competition. So like, yeah, while I go back and I say like, damn, like I missed out like potentially a lot of winnings and like money, like I was right before my time. The flip side of that is at least like I actually do have a lot of takeaways, and with that, like the experience that I've built after, I think it's like an added bonus that maybe some people nowadays don't experience, right? Like they're a pro player for 3 months and then they're thrown to the curb. And what are you doing? Everyone wants to be a streamer thinking that it's easy, right? But that's just not the case.
Right. Another thing I would ask is this. I mean, it might be a layup question, but I'll ask it anyway. Obviously, one of the problems, as you pointed out, is famously when NiP won that major, finally, the Cologne one, that was the vibe. Like, if people don't know, the reason Get Right broke down crying isn't because he won a major, guys. He's won fucking loads of majors at 1.6 and been all that. The reason is everyone thought that it wasn't going to happen because actually the team had sort of gone down a bit and you'd been in all these finals when you were at peak. So I think actually people thought, fuck, maybe we've missed our boat on this one. So it's kind of like, wow, finally we won. So the obvious question is, do you think if you'd won one of the first 2 majors and it had already sort of gotten out the way and it had established it, do you think that would have changed maybe the career path? Like, would people have not fucked with you internal? Like you said there, I was shocked by that, dude. I thought it was at the end, more like, you know, they're reading what fans say or they're seeing the results. They actually, even when the team was winning, was really actually like plotting to get you out or looking for an angle. That's kind of shocking to me. I would think like results could change that.
Yeah, no, I mean, even the first year we were undefeated, right? They still called for me to get removed. Yeah, I don't think that winning the first or second major would have made a change, like made a difference, especially knowing then the management wanted to have me out. Like the management wanted me out after 6 months of making this team.
Was it, by the way, was it like, I'm guessing some of the management people weren't like experts about CS. What was fucking with you? Why were they against you? Do you know?
Same thing. It's funny you say they're not expert of the space, but one of the management you got to remember was Heaton, right?
Oh, I thought he was involved, right? Fair enough.
Yeah, yeah. You'd argue that maybe a former player like that maybe would know more, but I think it became very apparent that like all they were thinking about was stats, and then when they saw the team, they look and be like, oh fuck, like Fifflaren missed that or whatever, like he shouldn't have. And I think at that time as well, we were sponsored by Infernal Line, and the owner at that place was also very into gaming, and he also didn't like me very much.
Oh, you mean that guy? I forget, the Budak or whatever, the one who was like the SK Gaming coach, but it was because he had it. That guy didn't like you as well. Okay, fair enough.
No, so they were very, so like it was really just like the Nicholas side of things. Like back then, that he was like, listen, like this team is functioning, it's working, like it's doing well, like we shouldn't be messing with this roster. I don't think winning the major, the first one or the second one would have changed my outcome. Okay. And if anything, like if you think about the way that my essential like removing of the team happened. Like we were, even during Cologne, I think our mindset as a team was always like, we show up at majors. Like we have won everything. It's hard to get us like mentally prepared for like an ESWC for $10,000 when it's like, we won that already like 3 times, like everything else. So like for us, it was always like, we're prepping Hent into like the major. So that last event I played was the ESWC. And that event, the same thing, they don't look into things, right? That event right before, I had just taken over in game leading duties again from Exist. He had called the event prior. My mentality heading into ESWC was, we have to get into shape for the major. It's only a few weeks away. I'm taking over the game leading. See this as...
If people don't know, by the way, it's ludicrous to judge any IGL off the first event. It takes a while to power up, obviously. You've got to get your system in place, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I had to get like, you know, Exist and I would always like swap off. Like he was the majority of it. But to give you an example, like the Katowice major we lost, I was the game leader for that event. And I'd argue, and I'm actually still firm on this. I'd argue that NiP you saw at Katowice is the best NiP you have ever seen us play. It's just that we completely blundered the final. Yes. But if you disregard that, like every single game, like we are so buttoned up, we were playing so well. And then it breaks. And then same thing after Katowice. Exist wants to call and he wants to take it back. That's totally fine. Like we never had issues like that in that regard. I think we worked really well together. But then at that last stint, then where we decided, hey, listen, like let's have Robin finish out the year calling. Like you're saying, you're coming in with the mentality of like, well, we have a lot of work to do. Mine and Exist calling was very different. Like I'd like to be a little bit more buttoned up and knowing what we were doing. Exist was a little bit more free roaming. Let's utilize the players that we have on the server, and let's really just, you know, trade well and go together and make something happen. Mine was a little bit more, the game is getting more strategical. We have to have like a little bit more proper executes and a little bit more proper defaults. Let's work on that. And obviously we play, I think 3 or 4 games at the ESWC. We play Cobblestone, it's best of ones. literally then. And I felt actually like coming into it, we didn't play bad. Like, I think that game we lost versus that French random team, Platinum or whatever. Like, yeah, you can go back and you can argue like, maybe we shouldn't have played that map or like whatever. My mentality was always like, there's so many learnings here for us. And now we have 3 weeks heading into the major. Let's work on things. And then coming into the major, same thing mentality is we're going to show up at majors. But people outside of the team obviously either didn't care or didn't know about that, right? Of like, oh, they're coming in. They were well aware that I was just calling for the first time after like, I think 7 months was the event before. Very much coming in, and we just have to be buttoned up. And then not getting the chance of really seeing ESWC then as a trial period and getting booted after that event. That's kind of that piece was hard for me. Like, you know, it was one thing, kick me after the major, you know, like, you know, for a fact that we show up at that time. I've been in 3 out of 3 major finals. We won 1, right? But I'm a finalist. Like, you know, for a fact that this team shows up. Why not give us that opportunity, especially for everything we've done over the course of the 3 years? But instead, it's like, no, kicking before that. We don't want to take the gamble. And sure, they still am the, you know, playing in final, honeymoon period and all that good stuff. But I'd argue, and Michael Little played great, but I still argue that with the pieces that we had coming into it, like, I was feeling very cocky and hopeful heading into that last major that I didn't get playing.
And the other thing as well, like, obviously you've spoken about it elsewhere and the others have all talked about it too, but people don't realize that, because that was the stupidest thing. That's one thing I do think you made a mistake with. If I were you, I wouldn't, this is the one thing you shouldn't have done. The money thing's separate, but I wouldn't have let them for so many years maintain that facade that you just retired. Because that's the worst thing, is that they secretly kicked you, just came to everyone, even told your teammates basically, like, no discussion, he's just fired, he's out. Like, Pete, I remember, it was like, what the fuck? Like, it was just at an event when you heard this, like, what the hell? And then so, like, it wasn't even like, there was no discussion. It's like, they just chopped your head off, essentially. Like, that part I do think's mad fucked up. Like, not only the way they did it, but then also they almost made you part of the bullshit. Like, you had to sort of go along with, like, I am retiring. Whereas, as we're seeing in this case, you weren't retiring. You want to keep fucking playing. Maybe you needed, like, a break from all the abuse and you want to fucking reinvent yourself. But you could have had years more to play, of course.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I wasn't at that. I felt really mentally drained just because I just felt like at that time, nobody wanted me in the space anymore. And it was such a hard feeling for me, especially when I'm like, again, I'm not a dick. I'm not like, I don't have this massive ego or like a douchebag in general. Like, I tend to be pretty positive. And what I got in return was just a lot of negativity. So that, yeah, I mean, to your point, right? I think definitely, I think had been, I regretted it 2 years after when I was at Twitch, and I was like, man, why? My mental state at that time when I was okay with them saying that I'm retiring was because I thought at that time it helped me not getting flamed more.
Right.
Like, if they go out and say we're removing Fifflaren, now all the justification for the past 3 years, and now I was thinking like, oh, there's gonna be 5 articles from Tommy now, you know, about like, oh, this should have happened a year ago or like whatever. And then rather than taking that hit, and I've been going through that for 3 years, my mentality was, maybe it's just easier to say like, listen, I'm hanging up the pad or whatever, right? Like, I'm stopping playing, like, and kind of see it there as like I'm doing them a favor. Obviously, looking back, that's why I wanted to do this interview with Richard when I did. Where it's like, I actually feel like now I'm in a position, my mental is better, like I'm past it. Like, I want to be able to tell my story, how it actually happened. Because I feel like the way that I was portrayed and like all of that, it wasn't justified. So that's why I came out with it. You know, it was years after. I didn't want to do it when I was working at Twitch because I just felt like a bit of a conflict, right? Like, Twitch was a sponsor at NiP, and I didn't want to be tied to anything specifically where it could jeopardize the job. So it's why I waited so long. Also, after like as soon as I was done with Twitch, I think I remember messaging Richard literally the day after and be like, hey, like, if you're down, like, would love to talk about my story with NiP. But yeah, looking back, probably wish that I didn't do any of that. But it's so hard. I mean, this is 10 years ago. And like I said, at that time, my mental was just so shot from all the negativity that I had experienced, all my family as well. Like, it was ridiculous, honestly. I just didn't want to have anything go through with it. So they told me, hey, Robin, we think it's best if you go out and we say that you retired instead. I was like, whatever, right? Like, I just been kicked. They'll tell me this a few hours later. I was like, whatever you guys prefer, right? I wasn't in any state to kind of like argue or talk to them at that point. I just wanted to be over with it.
I actually was going to ask about this question about the fact that a lot of people won't know you actually did in-game lead. And as he says, the problem is you're all going to remember how the Katowice major ended. But like, spoiler, go watch in the semi-finals when they're playing basically the Astralis players. They absolutely fucking body-bagged them. And by the way, this was a really skilled team. Like, so actually, if people remember, that was like, the difference looks stark. That's actually why people thought you were going to win the major. Right? The obvious question I have goes like this. I even feel like that's the area where even maybe the other players missed out on what the team was. Because here's the problem. In the early days, obviously, like, tactics in CS were way less developed. There was almost no utility usage. It was just flashbangs and the odd smoke. And back then, since you guys had like the best players and all the stats were crazy, it makes sense why they would think that like exist. If people don't know, it's kind of just call it like a classic Swedish default style. You know, you let the players play. They did the same thing in Fnatic as far as I know for years. You let the players play, and then you just sort of like you make a mid-round callers, or you group up when you go for the 2vx or whatever. But in your case, you had a way more sort of like, I could say you could have like a structured style of play. You had like more of a traditional in-game style. Well, the problem is this, right? Obviously, that style worked great with the loose style, but over years, obviously, the thing that was going to diminish was how big the gap between like Get Right and then the star player was. So, if anything, I actually think you could have made a smooth transition into a more structured team. And actually, I'm with you, mate. The joke is, it's not like Exist has to get kicked if you're the IGL. He'd be like one of the best fragging support players in the world, wouldn't he? So, I actually feel like the team would have just made more sense. If you're the IGL, that's actually the role to this day we allow to have the less frags. Like, because what we're sort of getting to here is, sadly, like you say, no one knew at the time. I mean, you haven't been on desks yet. No one knew it. You actually are a tactical thinker, and you were contributing that aspect. They thought, the joke is, they really thought Exist was the IGL, and all he did was say, Forrest to Get Right, go kill, and then chilled back or whatever. Like, they don't know that like you were involved with the structure of the team, and you were helping with the study of opponents and stuff like that. I feel like actually IGL was the obvious pivot for you.
Yeah, I mean, it was, and it was always, I mean, when we first formed the team, I was the game leader for the first 5 months, but we ran into a problem. Like you said, when you have so many skillful players on the roster and they're used to playing so loose, when you're then coming in and I'm saying, well, I want to be more structured, and this is early in the CSGO, like there's no experience to be made in terms of like players, like they just kind of felt like, man, like we don't want to play this structured, we want to play more loose. So like we gave it to Exist. But I think as time progressed, and I also think that's probably the reason why this team ended up getting worse and worse, is it gets to a time where everyone's going to be just as good as you. And what separates you are the strategies. And I've always ran with the mentality of, which is funny, obviously, with the team I ended up in, but I would rather have more smart strategical players than just 5 brain dead players who just goes down and aims. Because I say, like, these aimers might be the best, but if they get flashed, how are they going to kill you, right? Yes. Like, there's so much that goes into it. And I think that was always the problem that I had, even when I took over in game leader, like every now and then throughout my time at NiP, was we would always go back to like, oh, like it would be nice if we have something in between, but we're a little bit too structured now. Like, let's bring Exist back to call with the stuff that, like, let's say I invented, and like he gets to like learn from me in terms of I call. But I do think with this team that we had, like, especially at the end of it, like I mentioned, that last year we had Katowice right in middle of 2014, and then I left. And I think that's around the time, and we start to see it in 2015, 2016, the game is developing. And we at that time then didn't want to adapt to the game. We wanted to keep playing our same play style. As long as we shoot them harder, as long as we trade better, we're going to win. And nowadays, obviously, like you said, that's not really the case. And I think to your point about like my position, that was always the mindset why I said yes to all of this in the beginning when we made NiP. I was like, well, we have 4 incredible riflers here. We have Exist that just, came from Fnatic, semi-called, was in game leader. He has that shtick. We have a massive, aggressive entry fragger in Fireberg, 2-star players in Forest and Get Right. Why would you give Forest then the ability to be like primary op, right? But it's just like, no, I mean, you can pick it up, but like, we're not making that mistake where we're removing you from your best weapon. You go down the list and you say, well, we need an opper. Like at that time, it's kind of the beginning of CS2, where it's like, you don't need an opper, but like, you can get away with it. But at that time, I was like, well, we need someone, like, it needs to, in terms of like setting up or playing defensive and just thinking for like map control or info. But why don't I be the game leader then with an op? The structure is good because then you have the working group, right? You have the lurker and Get Right, and you have myself like holding angles. I actually think the concept there was good, and we still kept that concept, right? Even when Exist was calling, because Exist loved to be in the group with Forrest and Fireberg, which meant that I was always on this. Like, I ended up always becoming 4th, technically the support player, as where it's like I'm flashing them in, I'm holding rotates. If they need assistance, I will come in, right? So I used this, I think, in our old reflections, and I said a lot of the times when you notice that I was so quiet. It's like, well, either the round worked the way it should have, and everyone killed everyone because the flashbangs and everything was good, or they ended up dying, leaving me and get right in like 2-on-5 or whatever. And then what are the odds of like, you're just getting cleanup kills then? If I cared about stats at that time, I would obviously be a Jamie there, and I would just save and I would just get free kills. But you never see me doing that at that time. I do think like that trade, it is a bit of a miss. I wish that at time, looking back, that's the one thing I wish that I did more for my team back then, was putting my foot down when it came to the calling. Every time Exist would be like, hey, I'm back, like I want to call again, like I feel like I'm hungry for it or whatever. I was very easy to be like, absolutely, right? Like, proven, right? Like both of us have proven wins under this team as in game leading. You want to call, you feel like that's a better spot for you. Like, I'm okay with it. I think in certain moments there, I should have probably, after Katowice, for example, I wish that I would have put my foot down and I would have said, we have never played this good Counter-Strike before. And same thing, that was my first event calling leading up to that event for a stint. Like, I would like for us to continue with this. And then still add some Exist players in there. We don't have to be super polished on defaults or whatever, but in terms of general structure, in terms of the gameplay, like having better of an idea of where we're going to end up. I laughed. You mentioned I was on desks after, right? And it was still funny because you can kind of see then the change that happens. I remember there's an event in Cologne. This is now probably a year after the fact that I've stopped playing. And I am basically calling everything that NiP is doing at the start of the round. I'm calling, this is Inferno, their T side, and I say, as soon as they lose an entry, they're going to fall back and end up B. And it happens every single round. And I'm like, there you can kind of see the weaknesses that the team had as well, in terms of I feel like a good reason why I was there. I was a strategic mind. I was the one who wanted to reinvent stuff. And I think when you then have a team that's been so successful for so long, and they feel like, well, as long as we're doing that and we do it perfectly, nobody can stop us. You're getting increasingly more behind. And that's what I feel like you kind of saw there, which led to all of these players being dropped.
Yes.
Because they just never reinvented themselves on the server. And that you can account for, same thing. You can account that for management. They replaced me with star player, yep. Not realizing that, but who was the strategical end of this? Like, yes. Who was the guy who actually helped out Exist? Now that you remove me, now you're only putting all this pressure on Exist. And what was his strengths? Well, it was like being able to mid-round call very well and utilize the players. But if you're then up against strategical, like, do you think Michael Lele would be strategic? Like, do you think Alu? Like, he was a little bit more involved for sure. But like, you're removing a big identity and a big piece of these teams. And then when you do that, especially if you don't replace the in-game leader, right? Because we technically had two. Now you're basically just repeating your same mistakes. It's a big reason why Michael Lele and Alu had my positions for years after I stopped playing. And I think that was a massive miss in general. And like I said, I wish that I would have put the foot down more. I don't know if that would have changed things on my behalf, if I would have just been the in-game leader, like would have gotten rid of me, maybe not. I think they would have still found the excuse of, but Exist can just call, like, sure, just get rid of this guy anyway. So I haven't really thought about it in that capacity. The only thing I thought about was like, I wish that I just put the foot down a little bit more for myself with calling. I actually think the same thing going back to Katowice. I think it's one of my best events heading into the final, and I'm calling, right? And it's like, I'm doing a lot of stuff. And it's a shame. Yeah, I definitely think I was a better player in game leading than I was just being a player, because I was still doing a whole lot, right? I was still mid-round calling. I was still looking at radar. Like, because Exist one of these loose defaults, it came with the fact that like someone has to take control during these rounds. It can't just be like, a Farber go and peek by yourself. It's like, no, let's set these guys up. And a lot of that ended up being same thing, fourth man in, right? Or like the opera ends up being me. So I felt that a lot of times, even when I wasn't calling, like my time looking at radar, for example, compared to looking at my crosshair was not very good.
I'll also say as well, obviously this was 10 years ago, so we were all different people and we were less, whatever, enlightened, maybe weren't as mellow as we are now. And I also think we obviously like learned things along the way. Like, one thing I always say is when I do analysis, I use the concept of like lenses. You know, when you go to the opticians and he keeps doing that, like, which one's better? This one or this one? Yeah. This one. But it's like the idea is you see what's different, or what he's drawing something else out. Like, this one's better for far range, this one's better for short, you know. So what I do is like, I have certain concepts I try to apply, and then when I teach people the principle, they'll know when I refer to it. So what I've mentioned a million times on shows in probably the last 5-6 years is I have one now where I actually don't let myself do what the lurppis one did, because I've done it myself, which is this. My rule goes like this: if someone wins events, notice not one, they didn't just fluke an event, they just win events with some degree of consistency, big events, they cannot be bad at their job. Now, you could argue, you might think someone's better. You might think the team could be even better. They might think the style might be different. You might think that, but something every player is doing is right. Now, look, that doesn't mean they're all awesome. Maybe one is Ziwu, and he's the main reason they win. But I'll tell you what, if they're winning events with Ziwu, even the fucking worst guy is actually not bad. He can't be, because if you know Counter-Strike, mate, I always think, do people not wonder why super teams don't win? Those players are all straight fire. Sometimes something doesn't fit. Sometimes even a player that looks weak is doing something or covering something for a strong player that makes this player look strong. So one thing I do with that as well as the idea that like they must be doing something essentially I don't get, or something about this is working. I actually do this now, to be fair to Huxley in G2. I personally would replace him. I would want Nico to have like the best IGL in the world. But I tell you what, if he wins Cologne, he wins Canvas, I've got to let him stay for now. He's earned a chance at the next one. When he fails, then I'll call for him to be kicked. So my rule basically goes, you never change a winning lineup until you know it doesn't win anymore. Because the real problem is, it's usually not until you stop winning that you kind of realise why you were winning. You realise what worked in the team and what was going and what you did. So one thing I would ask you about goes like this. I also think another lens I had to apply over the years is, I think it's also why people like lurppis were so harsh, is they're only looking at things like fragging. They're only looking at the stats. And the thing you forget is this. They're humans. It's not robots. So the real problem is, it's not like everyone has like an aim. It's not like fucking FIFA where I have like the speed setting and that's no, like how I'm feeling attunes how I'm going to play or what I'm So one thing I think we missed as well was, I know the personalities of all the members of this team. You were the glue guy as well. You were the social component and like the lubricating factor, because if people don't know, look, I love all these people, as I'm about to say this. Get Right is a bit weird. It's one of the reasons actually I vibe with him, because we're both sort of weirdos who just weird in our own idiosyncratic world. And don't worry, I'm aware this happened to me. If I'm in a green room, it's the same as Get Right in a team. Everyone knows, like, essentially, just like, don't get into it, don't call us, just let him do the shit he does and then he won't complain. And then, but as a result, you live in a little bubble. You just get to not be the normal one. You don't have to be the guy who shakes everyone's hand when they go. Everyone knows he does his shit and he's great at it. So leave him there. People might know I think they've heard the stories. Now, there's a reason Makaleli didn't stay in that team, and it wasn't because he couldn't hit op shots. It's because he was annoying people, and people were getting pissed off with his vibe. Similarly, if people don't know, Forrest is brilliant, but he can be very quiet. He can be a little bit, standoffish. Even though he's your star player, he doesn't want you to call him the star player. They all have their own idiosyncrasies. Existing in Freiburg, have their own angles. I also feel like what they misunderstood was, look, inarguably as AWPers, Makaleli and Alu are better than you, but I don't know that they were better for NiP. I don't know if they were better for those four players. Like, I think those teams they were in were more explosive, but mate, they lost a lot of fucking close games. Like you're saying, in games that aren't about shooting people in the head, they weren't as good actually.
Yeah, and I think you forget as well, like if you go back, like my stats, it's so funny because if you compare and you look at where my positioning was, I ended up in a lot of clutch situations. There's a lot of, I'd argue that I had a lot of impactful kills throughout games. I didn't have a lot of them, but I think if you ended up putting me in that situation, Getrop was known as the clutch king, right, by far, and he definitely deserves that. But I think the second person on the NiP roster in terms of stats and winning those were actually me. So like when you fail to realize that, when you go into these close games, we talk about NiP magic. Well, how does that happen? Like, you know them very well of like to this day, right? You look at, for example, how Forrest treats like a clutch situation. Forrest is so naturally gifted at the game. He wants to kill everyone he sees. But with that, in clutch situations, he's actually not very good because he gets too impatient. Versus Get Right, he likes to lure, he likes to overbrain, like outthink people and stuff. Like, everyone had their strengths. It's a reason why, like, maybe it's a reason why I wasn't entry fragger, right? Like, same reason there of like Freiburg was a great entry fragger, maybe not so good in clutching. He didn't have the patience to like do that. And then you flip it on me. Oh, I had that. And then we look at then you bring in Makaleli. I think Makaleli had, he was new to the space too, right? He was, that new up and comer or whatever. I think what people fail to realize there as well of like, it's very different going from like playing tier 2 into tier 1.
Yes.
You get punished a lot. And at that time, if you compare how he plays, he ends up the same thing. He doesn't want to make mistakes. He's playing more passive. The team at that time is basically begging him and asking him to do things. So it's not a natural fit. And then you go back and we say, we need someone more experienced. Alu comes in, same thing, a little bit more experience and stuff. But you're still losing out on like maybe what made this team unique to begin with, where you have these quiet people. Like Getride is not a talker either on the server. He just sits there and lurks, right? You find these moments. Forrest, Forrest is one of the guys where as long as he gets set up and you tell him, hey, Forrest Freiburg, like we're going, he's gonna go, he's gonna help you. But he might not be the guy that on every single round would be like, hey, we're doing this.
Right.
So then when you remove that equation, again, everything falls on exist. and exists because he is very individually good as well. I'd say that one of the difference between him and I in that regard was that he probably was a little bit more thinking about like individual, like how do I get that kill, versus me would be how do I get set, how do I set up Fiber for that kill. And as you mentioned, I think a lot of that, even on the outskirts, like same thing. We go back to Tommy. I know there's a famous at this time. He had just played for EG, the North American team, and he had came out and he said, team chemistry doesn't matter. What matters is like 5 guys. They should be able to control it. It's a job, and it doesn't matter if they hate each other. Like they should like leave that at the door, and they should just go and perform. My mentality as a Swede is very different to that to this day. Especially when we're talking about teams of 5. We're not sports here. We don't have 25 players. You can just be like, this guy's a jackass. Let's just bench him. You don't do that here. So a lot of the times comes with how well does the team mesh, like the chemistry. And as you mentioned, on my end, I always like to have a good time. Like that was the whole premise of like, I obviously wanted to compete and I wanted to win. But my mentality is always like, if I'm having a good time, we're all fucking laughing and we're cracking up, we're winning these events because there's less pressure, because we're not putting that much pressure on ourselves. If we come in with, that mindset of like, listen, like we know what we're supposed to do. We know we're good. Like, let's have some fun with it. After, I think a lot of the teams back then felt that we were very closed off as an org. Like even after winning and stuff, we would always keep to ourselves. I think the reason why that ended up happening was the same thing. We had our little tradition, win or lose, we would go out and we would have some fun after, right? Like have a drink or whatever. Because you're Swedish, you're very introverted. Like you don't speak your mind unless you have a few drinks in your body. I mean, you're well aware of this.
Yeah, sure.
And that was the thing for us. Like we felt like those outings that we did as a team were the stuff that got us better. Because that time, like the filters were off. All of a sudden, there's so many famous, like so many funny stories with this team of like, we're out in Ukraine once and there's an argument at a pizzeria and Forrest ends up choking me. And it's like, it's not, it's not like aggressive. It's more so like just the camaraderie we had. I'd be like, oh, STFU, like blah, 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 he's choking me. And there you have on the side, they're laughing. And like the end of it comes with like the ability to say like, hey, Robin, you didn't do this very well. Like this needs to be better. Or like, hey, Forrest, like you're good at this, but we need to work on this. Maybe something that you wouldn't want to do on the server because people just get defensive and be like, oh, like that means that you think I'm shit or whatever. And that's obviously not the case. We're just here to improve. And same thing, I feel like that kind of camaraderie and stuff you don't see. And especially for us, I think it's a big reason why we had NiP Magic. It was that trust that we had in each other. Like no matter what, like win as a team, lose as a team, like we're going to get through this. If we do end up losing, I think we had a really good record of losing and then winning again in the counter matchup. A famous one is Katowice, right? The week after we go and win the Copenhagen game versus VP.
Yes.
And I don't think you do that if you are not a very well chemistry team that can talk about the bad and talk about like this was bad or whatever. And like this, how it gets better. Especially back then, like you said, if you're having bad events and you're like, oh, this guy, he's not doing whatever, just get rid of him. I think we did something that was unheard of, right? Where we kept the team intact for almost 3 years. And I would argue probably would have kept the team intact even more had it wouldn't have been for the
No, it could have been like VP. You could have just kept running for years and swap around roles. Yeah, absolutely. By the way, one thing I've even just thought of is the other angle is there's obviously the angle that like the team could have stayed together and gone elsewhere. Here's the other one. If I could go back in a time machine, here's the second plan I would have. Plan one is just go declare publicly, fuck the contracts you didn't pay us so that you keep it. Like we'll make back the next salary. But the other angle is you individually, I'm telling you, if I'd have known this back then, here's what we could have done, right? Since those orgs were sniffing around, like the LCS orgs, the TSMs of the world and CLG and Team Liquid, and they all wanted in. They all knew CS was like the hot shit. They have League already, but back then not that many of them were multi-game teams. They were wanting to branch out, and CS was the first one because they saw it's like getting big, it's even getting big in America. Dude, the joke is, if we went to one of those owners back then, like Steve from fucking Team Liquid or fucking Astro from Envious, before they got their teams, and we just said, Fifflaren's available, he'll move to America, he actually likes Americans, and he'd even be your IGL, you can build the team. That would be like, I think they'd all snap your arm off, mate. Like they'd love, if you notice, one thing people like to do with owners is you get the one guy you trust and then you build the project from him, don't you? I even think that would have been, if I look at how your life went, that actually might have been a great pivot.
Yeah, no, if I wasn't in such mental state, I would have probably done that, because I don't know if you noticed, but as soon as I moved to the States, I did this like fun team, right? The OGC. Oh yeah, true. Yes. Lurppis was on there.
True, he actually was, which is hilarious.
Shroud was on there. And it was kind of the same mentality, right? Of like, well, I still like the game at that time because I was so mentally damaged. Like my mentality was so negative of like, nobody was going to want me. That was my thinking. It didn't matter who I was or whatever. It was like, oh, like people are just happy of the fact that like I have now been removed, like I'm not going to get a single offer anymore. I stopped entertaining it, but I was like, it's still fun. Like I attended, I think, 2 local events in the US, again, very local, right? We ended up winning those. We made OGC. I had a great time. And I think the one thing, and maybe that was because of the announcement for Twitch or whatever, but actually I didn't get a lot of orgs reaching out, asking. Yeah, but again, you know, 3 years then, maybe a lot of orgs at that time also think like, no, listen, like he was the weak link, like why even bring him up or whatever. Nowadays, you see the rinse repeat for like literally every single, you know, player that has existed because there's not enough talent.
Yes.
Like again, I would be in a much better position now. But I do think because of everything that happened and stuff like that, and maybe because I went live or announced the fact that I had a job now at Twitch, like I didn't get a lot of outreach of people wanting to potentially like entertain having me to play. And at that time, obviously with the Twitch announcement, I was already in the US, right? And I would have had the ability to do so. Looking back, actually, like I don't even think that I've thought about it too much of like, oh, could I have continued my career in North America and stuff? I do think in the current landscape, I probably could have. Maybe that would have been fun. Yeah, I just felt like at that time, it's like, I love Counter-Strike, but I don't like the space. I don't like how I'm treated. Let me just go do something fun with my friends and then work on the side. I was still at Twitch working for CSGO. So like I was still there, but it was more so like the team aspect of wanted to be in the spotlight. Not to that degree. I think that's why like talent work like interested me a little bit, but not too much.
I've had to make a lot of tough choices in my career, but thanks to the support of my Patreon community, the Scrilluminati, I never have to make tough financial decisions. So this video and all the rest on my channel are kindly supported by Ahmed Haju, Frisky, Mac Pugnaccio Racula, Animosity, Jensen Gore, Tobias Bernasconi, Tosh, Toucan, and you know it if you've ever heard before, and you'll hear it many times in the future. A special thanks goes out to my main man, Jerry Keysminian. Do you want to ask a question in my video AMA? Do you want to be part of one of those long discussions where we talk about whatever you like in esports? Do you want teasers, find out who the upcoming guests are going to be? Or maybe you want to suggest a topic for a future Thorin's Thoughts type video? Well, if any of these perks or others appeal to you, put your money where your mouth is today and join the Scrilluminati by joining the Patreon link in the description box below.